Hey, welcome to the Cam and Otis show. Today, first ever, and I'm going to say it, the Father Son Squared show. I'm so proud of myself for coming up with that. I don't know why, but it's probably the dad joke side of me that I'm really letting go. And Greg Vanderrook was a guest, God, probably like 12 shows ago or so back a couple months ago. We'll just say that. And today we've got Greg's dad on with us, Bob. It's great to have you, Bob. Welcome to the show, man. Great to see you.
Thank you, Otis. Great to see your smiling face here.
Yeah, and Greg, man? It's been 2 months, 3 months, I think, since we talked.
That's right. Yeah, just about. I was just thinking about that today. And unfortunately, the world has changed dramatically in this time, and we're all adapting as best we can. And so this is a great moment for reflecting on leadership and family and connectedness.
Awesome. Great segue, Greg. And that's unrehearsed. This is well put. And that's what I would like to really get into is Bob and that leadership concept that and theory really is how have you adjusted to what's going on with COVID right now with your business and I don't know, your lifestyle, if you will?
Well, I'm semi-retired right now. I spent 30 years in business doing turnarounds and running challenging situations. Then I retired and thought I wanted to just chill, but I got bored, so I began teaching leadership and then writing about it. And then Greg invited me to co-author a book with him, and that put me on the speaking circuit and all that. So I've been trying to retire for 20 years, but you know what, Otis, I'm still so actively involved in so many things. I've found in my lifetime, to answer your question more directly, that whenever there's a crisis, that's a great opportunity to just rethink all the parameters, rethink what you're doing with your life, rethink how you want to come out of this thing. Because when everything's going rosy, people tend to get complacent. When it goes upside down, as it certainly is right now, that's the opportunity to really shine and when great leadership comes to the fore. So I'm completely reinventing myself for probably the third dozen time.
The third dozen time, man. That yes, is awesome. And that's the best attitude. That's what I've been pushing out. Canada's been pushing out and our networks and our messages out on social media is, man, what an opportunity. What an opportunity this is. What do you want to do different? Yeah, I love that. And I'll toss it to you, Greg. What are you doing? How are you shifting with this and the waves, if you will, riding them out?
Yeah, well, I think a couple of categories of that. One would be on the personal front. We're all adjusting to this new reality individually and as families. And my family unit here that is under the stay-at-home order here in Colorado is the four of us, my wife, Christina, and our daughters. And we've actually just done an international move within the last year. We moved here from Sweden, and we've adjusted to remote learning and all of these things. And so there's been a lot of support for us as a family in terms of supporting our daughters in 7th grade and 5th grade with their schools, supporting the teachers and the education, and also that emotional stability, trying to stay connected as a family, and just trying to think of things through the eyes of a 13-year-old and 11-year-old. I was just reflecting. I wrote a blog the other day about something that a friend of mine said to me a long time ago when I was a new parent, and he said, "They're only young once," and that really hit me very hard. And so now during this time in the category of leading self, including leading your family, I think I'm trying to honor that and be present for my wife and our girls. It's hard anyway with an international move when you have family overseas and these things. And so that's a big piece of it. And then in terms of the work that I do in terms of training, speaking, teaching, and these kinds of things, I've tried to bring some new thinking into it and to help people think through leading in a crisis, as well as focusing on the leading self piece of it and that sort of personal resilience side. And so, because I think there's definitely an inner game, we're all playing the business model pivots and we're trying to figure out strategies and, Zoom technologies and everything. But there's also that inner voice and that inner game that we all have to play to keep ourselves centered and to find safe harbor. So I've been trying to contribute in my way in that area as well.
Yeah, I think that's something that, we can dive right in on, as far as there's so many different aspects to a situation like this that you have to account for when you're planning. And what you're talking about right there, to me, that's really the cornerstone. That's the building blocks of what you're starting off with, is you have to have your mind right, and you have to be centered as far as what is going on and what that means for you, so you can then be able to plan out of it. And then when you start looking at planning, this is something I found interesting in the last week, as I've talked with a few folks, is most people are doing some real big crisis planning of right now. What can I do right now to change? Like, how am I going to prevent this from the next pandemic? When there's a pandemic in another 100 years, how am I going to be ready for that? And the thing that struck me about it is that they're not talking too much about the transition out of the pandemic. And I found that was very interesting. It seems like there's a big planning lapse of preventing the next one and preventing the fallout that we're all facing right now, and then trying to get everything going in this current situation, but not thinking about that first week out. And I think that's something that I'd love to talk to you a little bit more about as far as the strategy goes, because if you don't have that, you're going to fall behind just as bad. You're going to be 3-4 weeks behind the curve of all your competitors, because they're planning to be ready for that. So they have their second plan of action, so that as soon as the stay-at-home order gets lifted, they're ready to go, and they already have that plan in place.
Well, I think that's a great point, and I think it tees up one of the key things here. In a crisis, we need to identify the root of the problem. What are the core issues that are affecting us deeply? Obviously, for businesses, there's a cash position that we need to protect, and we need to protect our most valuable asset, which is our people, and be thoughtful about that. But to your point, I think that's right. I think there's this kind of immediate focus, and then there's kind of, what's going to be the next pandemic or when it's all gone. But in the meantime, there's this probably extended transition period. And I think, communication, is a really important part of this. And, that's difficult because trying to get the facts, that's hard because, there's different viewpoints out there from public health experts and from economists, and, the stock market's changing dramatically up and down. But also, there's not a lot of clarity, but still, I think we need to communicate and over-communicate as leaders, right? And to try to prepare people, to your point, Cam, mentally for what's coming. And, a lot of people have been talking about lately, you can't just flip a switch here, right? It's not that simple, right? And so there's going to be phases. And so preparing your team, your colleagues psychologically for that, and including them in the planning process for that, so that they are part of it. They feel valued, they feel heard, and they're going to own it then as well, as opposed to imposing it from the boardroom, et cetera. So those, I think, are some key pieces here.
Yeah, let me just build on that, if I may, Cam, because I think that's an excellent question. And Greg hit a lot of key points there about communication and stability, the psychology of things, the people, the relationships. We wrote in Triple Crown Leadership in our chapter on turnarounds that when you're the leader in a turnaround situation, and we're all going to be coming out of a turnaround situation because the world's going to be upside down, before you can establish financial stability, you have to establish psychological stability. Because if people are panicked and if people are overly emotional, you can't think rationally. And so it's not the first week of what you do in the first week so much, Cam, as what you do now with your team preparing for the first week. And so building trust, being honest with them, talking about your plan. It's not just having a great plan that you think about in the quiet of your room and then you implement it in the first week. You've got to have your plan, your strategy, your new normal, but it's got to be a team effort, because whatever it's going to be, you can't do it by yourself. So you need to build those relationships. What we're seeing as we all shelter in place is that So many of us have been on these treadmills for so many years, and now we're sheltering in place with our daughters or our spouses. And it's a chance to rebuild the relationships. There's a great quote I heard years ago: business, life, leadership is all about relationships. And so if we can use this time while we're still not coming out, getting ready to rebuild those relationships, to rebuild the trust, to get the psychological stability, to get the buy-in from the people about how we're going to come roaring out of the gate, that's going to mean all the difference in the world, because there are many leaders who won't do that. They're going to be on their own thinking about what they do, how do I get government money or whatever, and their team won't be ready. The teams that come out of the gate full bore, all of them together with the culture, with the relationships built, with the trust higher, that's going to be the winner.
That's spot on. I love that too, because, as you were saying that, I was reflecting back to, my military days and in the operations and kind of thinking in the different phases of operations. And by the way, if you didn't know, all good military plans always have 5 phases. I don't know why. I don't remember why that ever was, but I just remember that all good plans have 5 phases. Somebody
what
told
are the 5 phases of it?
Phase 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5.
Got it. All right, good.
I mean, it's not it's simple military stuff, right? But in that mindset, all joking aside, if you think about this, we could go back, and this applies to actually some operations that I did set up. And pre-COVID would be phase 0, right? That's where we're in this not really doing things where we may or may not be setting some things up for a crisis to happen to us. And then phase 1 is, bam, we get hit with, okay, everything's shut down. And that's what happened, 3-4 weeks ago. And everybody right now should be like what you were talking about, Bob, should be in phase 2, which is, hey guys, it's going to be okay. We've got this. Why don't we figure out how to do this, how to set this up? What's next? Who are our customers we can talk to? Who are our clients, existing clients that we can stay in communication with? All those little things that we can do as a team to when as Governor Paul called it, phase 2 happens. Now the stay safe at home, I think is what he called it. When that happens next week, now we can move into phase 3, kind of the I'm referring to that kind of as a intermittent, not intermittent, man, I just drew a blank on the word. That pre-phase of intermittent, boy, howdy, I'm just lost that word. So anyway.
Intermediate maybe.
Yeah, maybe intermediate norm is what I was trying to go towards. And then in another month or so down the line, when we make another adjustment to, what are we doing with restaurants and meetings and things like that, that's the next phase. And then finally, what's the new normal? Phase 5, if you will. What's that new normal of our operation going to look like? Is it every 3rd seat at the Pepsi Center at an Avalanche game or something like that? Whatever that's going to be. What is that new normal? So yeah, and as I was babbling about the I word and I couldn't think about it, one of the things I wanted to ask you, Bob, was with all the business, you said 40 years of business experience, there's got to be, I mean, this is very different, we all know, but there's got to have been some peaks and valleys that you've latched into and gone, back then, this is what we did. And I'm just kind of curious, what's some lessons you pulled out of those?
Well, we talked about a lot of the lessons in Triple Crown leadership. I worked over 30 years, Otis. And by the way, thank you for your service. That's wonderful, the service that you had in the military. But I worked in 30 years in business, and I was always a student of leadership. I was seeking out challenging situations to see what I could learn about leadership, because my premise was that if I could learn to lead in crisis times, it would be a lot easier to lead in normal times. And so I gravitated, we moved a lot. My wife and I have lived in 11 states. We've moved 18 times. I worked in 8 different industries, from high tech to low tech. And I was always seeking challenging situations. And what I discovered was that the challenging situations were oh so more challenging than we thought they would be. When you take over a public company that's in crisis, where all the stakeholders are angry, where the stockholders are selling your stock, the short sellers are coming in, your best customers, won't order anymore, where vendors won't ship you except cash, and your best people are leaving, you've got a crisis on your hands. And so you think you've hit the bottom, and then some other whammy hits you. And then you say, oh my God, it couldn't get any worse. And those are the worst things you could say, Otis. And it definitely gets worse. We called one turnaround that I was running an organ donation, because it literally felt like you gave a lung, you gave a spleen, you gave a kidney, and then it just got worse. But what I learned was that it was all about the people. It was about the relationships. There are certain toxic people. Greg and I have a chapter in Triple Crown Leadership. He can tell you about that in Steel and Velvet. And you got to take some of the toxic people out, because they are a cancer on your organization. But once you've done that, and once you've established the culture, a values-based culture, a culture that we can get through this, but only we together. I was never smart enough. I couldn't work enough hours to do it, but I knew that we together could do that. And once the people believed that, then the answers came. The answers came from the manufacturing floor, from the engineering lab, from the sales floor, from the customers. It was all about the relationships and the culture. And then there was nothing we couldn't accomplish. Once you got through the bottom of the crisis and got rid of the toxic people, it was like Katie barred the door. And that was awesome. And that's the opportunity we have right now in this pandemic. Get rid of the toxic people, get your culture, get your people, get your new thing. And just when that first week opens, as Cam was asking, just open the doors and let it go. You guys can be awesome. Those are the lessons that I learned.
Man, I'd love to get Greg, since you co-authored it, that same perspective from your, or same point from your perspective.
Yeah, well, I'd say this, the famous expression, culture eats strategy for breakfast. Bob was just talking about the importance of the people. And I think, looking back on a career, that's what you're going to remember. It's going to be those relationships. And so obviously all these other things are important too, the strategy, the operations, the business model, but all those sort of swim inside the culture, which is the relationships of the people. And so, we really emphasized a culture of stewardship in Triple Crown Leadership, where there's a sense where everybody is a steward of the shared purpose, the shared values, and the shared vision that they together have come up with. Everybody is a steward of the quest. What is the quest? What is the ultimate aim of this organization? And in our model, we talk about, it's called Triple Crown, because we say, why not aspire to build an organization that is three things? It's excellent and ethical and enduring. And that's the Triple Crown, the 3 E's, right? But everybody is a steward of that quest to be those things. And everybody is a steward of the culture. And as leaders, we want to have them so involved and so engaged and feel so valued that they are unleashed to exhibit their own leadership, their own creativity, their own innovation, their own ownership in a dance of leadership and followership. And so when we do that in a crisis, we can develop some kind of operating rhythm, right? And so that's another thing that came out of our work. But I just have to pause and say, you asked the question of me, but I want to answer it both for me and my dad, because one of the things that I learned from my dad and his business career and all the crisis work was also the importance of what he calls sanctuary. And this goes back to the leading self piece. If we're going to lead through a crisis, whether it's a traditional business crisis, if there is such a thing as a traditional business crisis, or a global health pandemic that is at least a double crisis, on the health front and the economic front. We have to find ways to ground ourselves. What is the safe harbor, right, amidst the storm? And there's so much pressure on leaders and people are looking to the leaders to have the answers and to solve things. And as my dad said, no one is that smart. There's too many variables, there's too much complexity, there's too many systems here, systems on top of systems that are under strain. And so we have to have good personal practices. For my dad, it was running 5 miles a day every day, and and each of us has our own thing. And also create an environment and encourage our colleagues and our family to have their own personal resilience practices too, so that we can be at our best, so that we can survive, so that we can thrive and come to the opportunity on the other end of all this.
Yeah, one thing I think kind of ties in on that Bob, you mentioned earlier that I think would be a great thing to really dive in on is talking about how crisis reframes your situation, whether it's business or personal, whether you're working your 60-hour week and now you're spending more time with your daughter or whatever type of switch it is, you're really reframing your life in that, and you're reframing your business. And something as catastrophe reframes life, I think one thing that's interesting there is how do you simulate that? How can you simulate this artificial catastrophe, artificial crisis that can then present that opportunity for you in a normal situation? We've described it before as the pre-mortem. We've talked about quite a bit, Dad, of how you picture the day that you're launching your business and everything goes wrong. Why did it go wrong? And so I think the idea of creating an artificial crisis would be an extremely effective twist on that pre-mortem of, okay, if everything freaking goes wrong, if the whole economy collapses, what are we going to do? And it allows you to reframe it so that you're looking at it in a more efficient way. You're no longer looking at it in a right now, what do I do to make sure I keep the lights on? You're looking at it in a big picture. How do I have a more successful business in the long run? So Greg, do you have any thoughts on how would you create an artificial crisis for your team?
Well, I really like this line of thinking. And most people, to your point, they talk about a post-mortem. They talk about the after-action review, and you're talking about the pre-mortem. And I think this is hard for human beings just because of the way that our brains are wired. And so we don't have a good relationship when it comes to risk or to seeing risk, and these kinds of things. I've certainly experienced this, in my startup chapters where we had a lot of crises and these kinds of things where we weren't seeing around corners. And so one of the things that I like comes from Alexander Osterwalder, who's he created with Yves Pigneur the business model canvas that has become really world famous, and that has become a real part of the lean startup movement and design thinking and agile software development. And he likes to do what he calls a kill thrill exercise with teams. And so I used to do this with my students. And so, often if you have an idea for a new venture, if you're an entrepreneur or an intrapreneur with a new product or service, your brain kind of tricks you into falling in love with your own idea, right? And so we have to find ways to kind of de-bias things through a good process with other people. And there's some group dynamics that work against that because you've got groupthink and things like that, where a lot of people don't want to be the naysayer because they get shunned by the group, and then you get the stress response, and it has this whole sort of team dynamic happen. And so if you can actually do a kill thrill exercise, which is, okay, you take your idea and everybody on the team says, let's go kill it. So everybody needs to brainstorm what could possibly go wrong with this idea, right? And you get a lot of energy because there's no wrong answer, and you just like almost the worse scenario, the better. And like the more bad scenarios, the better. And what you're doing is you're socializing de-risking, right? You're making it cool, or you're rewarding people who can see around those corners and look at possible scenarios. So you spend some time doing that. And then obviously you can go back and you can kind of rank probabilities, which is always a good idea, right? And you can also rank mission critical. Like some things may go wrong, but it's not a big deal. But if this goes wrong, that's a black swan event. And so we really need to avoid that. So you want to look at what are the risks, what are the probabilities, and then what are the effects. But then, so you finish the kill brainstorming, right? And then you turn it into, okay, let's thrill, right? And let's go brainstorm on how to de-risk the killers, right? And then everybody's part of saying how to be a part of the solution. I think that's a really good tool And it's also a lot of fun, and it's a good bonding experience for the team, by the way, too, which is always nice.
Well, I think is interesting on that, and it's something, and I'm not even sure if I'll get a question out of this as much as just an interesting behavioral phenomenon that you see, is that when you talk about it this way, you people in general have this headwind tailwind fallacy, that it's you feel everything hitting you in the face, you don't realize all the things working behind you. But then for some reason, whenever you need to think about the things that are hitting you in the face, you can no longer think about it. For some reason, at that point, you have to come up with things like pre-mortem or the kill thrill, which I love, by the way, and implement those, because otherwise everyone's just focusing on the tailwinds and how great that idea is and how smart they're feeling right now. But in reality, that's not the real situation. And so I think, what it really comes around to, and again, not really coming to a question the more I talk about it, but what you wind up with this headwind tailwind fallacy, and then what you're talking about with the kill thrill, is you're reframing the question and trying to remove any of the emotional biases that each individual of the team has. And the point is that they can have both types of those fallacies. So you can have the negative Nancys who only feel the things that are hitting them in the face. All they feel is that headwind. And that can suck, and that can drag your team down. That can be a toxic person inside your team, like you've been talking about. But just in the same way, you can have people that can be over positive. I know I fall into that category more than I don't, that I love my ideas. I'm so smart. I had such a great idea last night. It's the best business idea ever, but it never comes together quite like that. And so you have to really be able to remove all of those biases from those situations.
Yeah.
But you can do that.
Go ahead, Bob.
No, I'm sorry, Greg. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I really think we were talking about the importance of people here, and as people, we've got these brains that have evolved over the long period of time, like we talked about the last time, and we really need to understand the way our brains work. And to your point, Cam, one of the other robust findings from the research on the brain is the planning fallacy we found, which is that when we're making plans, we tend to overestimate the positives, the revenue growth and the profits, and we tend to underestimate the costs and the time. And all three of those are true at the same time. In other words, they're compounding, and which becomes a really big problem for your cash flow and et cetera. And so we need to be able to work through that. And again, there are it used to be that people would do the business plan, and the business plan I think is a good tool in some circumstances still. But for early stage or situations where there's a lot of noise, I think the lean agile models, the kind of first screen, the kind of very lean and mean ways to kind of actually test, as opposed to having a cascading set of dozens of assumptions that you believe will become true and you model appropriately. I think there are ways to kind of de-bias the people and the process that I think are very, very helpful in this scenario.
Yeah, let me chime in on some of that, because I think those are excellent questions. I'm not sure I'm going to sign up to saying we have to remove biases and we have to create artificial crises. So I want to go beyond that. I mean, I think what we're talking about is change, and a crisis is just extreme change. So how do we get people to be willing to accept change? Most of us don't want to accept change. Why? Because we're in a box. We know the box. We're comfortable in the box. The box has known parameters. We're managers. We plan and we budget and we schedule, and those are all the techniques of management. But management and leadership overlap, but they're not the same thing. Leadership says, okay, here we are managing in our box and we're really comfortable. We don't need a lot of change. But you know what, guys? There's another box over there that's really, really better. And people say, oh yeah, boss, but gee, we don't want to go. We're not sure how to do that. We know how to do this box. No, this box over here. So how do you get people to move out of a box that they're comfortable with and go to a box that they're uncomfortable with, but which is likely much better for them? That's what a crisis is. This pandemic is a huge change movement. How do we get people? We're never going to go back to the old normal, Cam. It's going to be a new normal. Restaurants, travel, sports, they're going to be different. Some things will be the same, but a lot will be different. So thinking we're going to just flip the switch and go back to the way it was in January 2020, that's fallacious thinking. What's going to be? So how can we prep people as leaders not to create artificial crises, but what can we practice? What can we do? Well, I just made a note of several things. We can rotate people out of their assignments. Finance people should go into sales for a while. Manufacturing people should go into engineering. You know, strategic planning people should go work in the factory or something like that. We should assign buddies. So a finance person works with a marketing person, and an engineer works with a salesperson. We should demand that we reinvent our products, that we assume that it's going to be gone, that somebody will come in with a whammy from the side and say, how are we going to reinvent this product line? We ought to have devil's advocates. Every time we're coming to a consensus on something and the room is getting groupthink going, oh, we're all wonderful, who's going to play devil's advocate and say, hey, wait a minute, you know, I need to challenge that assumption. And somebody ought to be tasked with being the devil's advocate. Otis, military after action reports. After every engagement, we did an after action report. What went well and what went wrong, and what do we learn from that, and how do we build it into our training for the next one that comes up? And if you keep doing that, you will prepare yourself for change. Going down to the first line, who's the person making the product? Who's the person serving the customer? Are we in touch with them, or are we sitting up in our office in our cubicle in our ivory tower? So there's a lot of things that we can do without creating an artificial crisis or trying to artificially remove biases to get people ready to change and embracing change. The key parameter for success in today's world is the adaptability of your people. Can they embrace change? If they can't, you're going to be toast. If they can, and you've got that culture that embraces it that Greg was talking about, then you can ride out all these crises and storms and come out better on the other side. Does that make sense, Cam?
I think so. And I think, you know, it draws me back to something, Dad, you taught us back playing rugby. You got to be flexible. That's what it really comes down to, is no matter how many tools you have to know when to use them. If it doesn't work, you have to know to use the other tools. And you kind of have to have that constant flow of flexibility and be able to use that in order to be flexible and make those adjustments as you go.
Yeah, I mean, the cross training is what we thrived on in the special forces. I mean, we were each guy on the team had an extreme specialty. I mean, the training that the guys went through on my teams, you know, was just unbelievable, the amount of knowledge that they would gain. But we spent all of our time when we weren't deployed cross-training each other on our skills. And that provided a balanced approach. We still had the expert, but if something happened to that expert, we had enough people that, you know, knew enough to get us by and kind of fill that space. And plus, and this is the point, I think that's great about what you're talking about, then you can sit in that other seat and see what the perspective is. You can understand why the finance guy needs this information from the shop foreman, and why that has to happen in order to enable him to do his job. And I think that is by doing that, and that experience is such a key piece to, man, I mean, there's so many aspects of building your team that go into that. And I wanted to, while I got the floor, because there's so much good going on, I wanted to throw something else at you, Bob, that I was really curious about. When you would go into the business, and I think this is going to be something that helps our listeners, when you'd go into one of those new businesses that you're building back up, a takeover, I'm sorry, I don't remember the phrase you used for that, but what was the triage process you used when you walked in? Because I think that's something that business leaders right now can use, that same thought process or however you describe it.
Well, one of the things that I learned the hard way by not doing it and screwing up a few times. I've been fired a couple times in my life and hired, promoted, and I think I learned the most when I got fired. But I learned one thing, and we talk about it in Triple Crown Leadership, at one large public company that was in serious crisis, lawsuits and all the terrible things going on. I gathered the senior staff and some other people, 20, 25 people in a conference room. I asked them to plan for the whole day, and I said, I want to go through and hear from all of you, each of you, one at a time, in no more than 30 seconds each, a problem that we face, whether it's major or minor. And I'm going to write it down on this flip chart page. And we're going to go around this table of 25 people until and it's okay to pass, Or you can say, here's a problem. You have to describe it in 30 seconds or less. And I'm going to write it down until we have all the problems. And we're going to go around this table until all 25 people have passed 3 times. 75 passes, because I want all the passes out. So we're going to start over here with Sam. And Sam says, a pass. Okay, Mary, pass. I'm not sure we should have reserved parking in this kind of crisis. Okay, reserved parking, question mark. Pass. I think we've cut back on quality. It's a silly thing, but the toilet paper is really scratchy toilet paper, So you're going around the room passing and all this stuff until finally somebody says, well, I think the board has been complicit in some of these financial restatements. Board complicit in financial restatements. Pass. This process takes several hours, and you have to take breaks and things like that. And it gets really frustrating because then you get 50, 60 passes, and the people are ready to go on, and then somebody says, well, I got another one. Sales thinks that engineering lies to them about release dates of new products. Engineering lies to sales about release. And then we have to start all over again. Well, so this takes a half a day or something like that. And then what you've done is you have just got everything off of everybody's chest. By the time you get 75 passes, it's all there. Then you go through let's put these into groups. Well, there are certain financial issues. There are certain communication issues. There are certain HR issues. There are certain board issues. Okay. And now let's put priorities on them, A, B, C, because we can't do everything at once. This is clearly an A. This is mission critical, and this is urgent. That's an A. This is mission critical, but it's not really urgent. That's a B. This is a C. Okay. Now, let's just take the A's. We're not going to do any of the C's. We'll try to do all the A's. Who could volunteer to lead some of this stuff? And so you get some volunteer. Well, that's a financial issue. I can take that. Or, that's in my area. I can ask Mary, who's not here, to head that up, and I'll make sure she does. Okay, so you get some volunteers. And you notice who's not volunteering, You notice who's just sitting back there like this. And there are some sitting back there just like this. What the hell's going on here?
Yeah.
And then now we come to a key part. All right, guys. We're now going to talk about some shared values. We've got all this history behind us. How are we going to operate? What are the behaviors that will guide us? Are we going to treat each other with respect? Are we going to build trust? Are we going to operate with integrity? So you come out with a draft list of shared values. That takes an hour or so. And you say, all right, this is a draft list. We're going to work on it, but this is our draft list. Now, here's the key point, Otis. I don't have time to go back and deal with all the history here. Who shot John? Who's sleeping with who? Who lied to who? So as of this moment, we've got all the issues there, all of them. We've got them prioritized. We've got volunteers. We've got our new set of shared values. So I'm going to ask you all to operate by these new shared values as we attack these items. And we'll have periodic meetings to see where we stand. And we're going to grant amnesty for all prior sins. I don't want to hear who lied. I don't want to hear who shot who. This is a new day, amnesty. And if you can't live with that, come see me afterwards. We'll make arrangements for you to be very successful elsewhere, because this is the way we're going to operate. That one-day process was critical to get rid of all the crap, to get a new focus, to get a new set of behaviors, and go forward. I found that single day was very powerful, Otis. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah. I love that process. I mean, it's methodical. It's involving the leadership, because it's so critical to have the leadership there, because you're trying to change. You need the early adopters to it, and the change managers in their own. And then the thing that I thought was awesome, I mean, you did a one-day culture change. Now, it truly takes time to really go all the way out into all the way down into the lowest levels of the company. But by doing that right there, it's a stop. Old stuff's gone. We're moving this way in this fashion. And that right there, because I get approached by a lot of guys about, hey, what about culture? What if I'm in a company that culture sucks? That's a great process right there to just bam, hard stop, if you will, cut it away, move forward in this direction. So I appreciate that, Bob.
One of the things that we addressed in Triple Crown was leadership breakdowns, which is, why do organizations break down? What leads to the crisis? I mean, so we studied that too. And we've developed a leadership derailers exercise that we use when we're working with leaders. What takes leaders off track in addition to what takes organizations in the breakdown. And one of the derailers that's very common among even successful leaders that we found, or that I've noticed, is conflict avoidance. Tends to be a really big problem in a lot of cultures. And Patrick Lencioni talks about this in his work a lot. Mm-hmm. And so Bob mentioned earlier, one of the key points of the Triple Crown model is what we call steel and velvet. And so this is the notion that we all, as leaders, have a certain personality and certain disposition and preferences. And some of us are softer and some of us are harder by nature. And that's okay, but an excellent leader needs to do what the situation requires, regardless of their personality. And so in a crisis, we need to be steel, operating at the hard edge of leadership much more often. Accountability, intensity, drive. And I think the example that Bob just walked us through was an example of steel, right? I mean, it's a mix in some ways because there's participation and whatnot, but this kind of notion of, if you can't get on board with this, and if you're not willing to provide amnesty, you cannot stay, because we are now forward looking, we're not backward looking. And that's an example of steel. And I think people in a crisis will respond to that very well. That they're looking for that kind of character, for that kind of courage, for that kind of leadership, because they see that it's required, and not people who are going to defer back, or they're not comfortable. They don't want to make someone else comfortable. They need people to step into the charge. And so I think that will earn you some credibility as a leader.
Something big that I think we've kind of touched on in a few different ways that I think would be good to get into is the idea of, so what do you focus on during a crisis? I think something I picked up on, and I want to say it was Jeff Bourgeois that gave me this last week. I'm not 100% sure on that though, but I'll give him the credit. But you want to focus on things that are important but not urgent. This is the time where you're no longer bound, like we were all talking about. You're no longer bound by the traditional constraints that we're all stuck inside of. You're past that now because you're stuck working from home all the time, or whatever your situation is. And so now it's a time to look for that second quadrant. If you what is it? Important and urgent, important, not urgent.
Just the Eisenhower matrix.
Eisenhower matrix. There we go. Makes me sound like I know what I'm talking about. But now's the time you look into the important, not urgent stuff. And as we've been talking through this, the way I see it is that's the reframing that needs to be going on inside a company. That's the cultural shifts that need to be going on inside a company, because those don't strike you as urgent when you're in the day-to-day operations. It doesn't matter that I'm going to use his name, Jeff over in accounting is going to be a problem. And he was a CPA too, so that works. But Jeff over in accounting is being a problem. That doesn't matter in your day-to-day operations necessarily. But once you step back like this and you kind of reframe the problem and reframe your business, then you realize that those type of things are really pulling your team's performance down, and that those are the type of things you need to be addressing right now. Those are the big pivots. Those are the cultural changes and those type of things that you've been putting off for a long time, but right now is the best time to do those.
I think that's right. I think, what we pay attention to, I mean, first of all, we need to stay above the death line, I think, as Jim Collins said. And so we need to make sure that in the crisis, cash is king. We're not running out of cash, or, we're protecting our people and these kinds of things. But I think it's easy for everybody, and I think, Cam, you were talking about this earlier, for everybody to just sort of go to immediate short-term issues. I think somebody's got to rise up, and I think the chief executive, other leaders on the board should really make sure that you're thinking about the short term as well as the long term. How is this all going to play out? And what's the bridge in the medium term to get there? And so in the turnaround chapter, we made a distinction of different types of turnarounds. And some of the turnarounds are, I forget the term, but they're kind of crass and it's just about flipping. I think it's a flip, right? Versus, is this a rebirth? And is there an opportunity to become even better and to have a stronger culture? And so, and that's obviously what we focused on. That was the focus of my dad's turnaround career in business. And so thinking about your decisions in both time dimensions, and this really goes to that enduring element of the Triple Crown. Right? To do well today, but we also want to set us up for sustainable success tomorrow and over time as well, while operating ethically, the ethical imperative as well.
So one other thing I think, Bob, you were touching on a little bit as far as the mechanisms you were talking about as far as creating that culture and moving forward. One thing that I really latched onto with that is the idea of, to use the phrase sunk cost, that everything that has already happened, it's a sunk cost. You don't need to be thinking about that. And that's something I found myself so much in a leadership position trying to stress to people, and they can't break out of that logical fallacy that that's all they want to think about. I'll use the easy example before I pick on my older kids of going to my little kids, the Engage Foundation, and oh well, such and such pushed me over, and so I went over and I tried to push him over, and I said, it's just like you said, Bob, I really don't care. I don't care who's sleeping with whose wife. I don't care who shot who. It does not matter, because we're looking at right now and we're moving forward. And you have to be able to have that perspective. And ideally, your team can have that perspective as well. But really, just as a leader, you have to be able to leave all of that crap in the past and just move forward and push forward through everything. Take everything. It's all facts. That's what happened. Doesn't matter. We're moving forward no matter what happened in the past. It doesn't actually matter, because the future is what's in front of us. There's I'm not even going to bother trying to get the exact quote. It's a Seneca quote about death, that we're all fearful of death because we think death is ahead of us. Death is behind us. Death is everything that's happened to us already. And that's I think that really just epitomizes the sunk cost fallacy of, it's already happened. It's dead. Who cares? Let's move forward.
Yeah, you didn't get the quote right, but you sure got the meaning right. Yeah, spot on. Go ahead, Bob.
And it all comes back to what Greg was talking about before about culture and, establishing those shared values. Well, one of the things we talk about in our work, and that Greg does a lot of work on now as I'm trying to retire, is we actually advocate that everybody have 2 jobs. Now, does that sound crazy to you guys? 2 jobs? You got to have a clear job. What are my parameters? Well, you have your normal job in finance or marketing or engineering or whatever. But we've now got these shared values. We've got this vision statement. We've got this purpose of why we exist beyond just to make money or something like that. And we've all bought into that. And Greg used the term, it's chapter 6 in our book called Stewards. You're a steward for the culture. And so we give everybody an irrevocable license to lead by the values. Let me repeat that. We give them an irrevocable license to lead by the values. That means you have 2 jobs. You have your regular job in finance. And if you see anything that any of us do, even me, the boss, that you think is in conflict with our vision, our values, our culture, you are empowered to speak up. We will never shoot the messenger. We will never shoot the messenger. Everybody has got a second job of being a steward for the culture. Then you really have a chance to, as Greg said before, unleash people. None of us are smart enough in this constantly changing world to deal with all the stuff being thrown at. All we can undo is unleash all the good people that we have around us that are bought into our purpose, values, vision, our culture. All we can do is unleash them, give them an irrevocable license to lead, and that's going to be awesome. Sorry about the background phone.
That's all right. That's awesome, because it reminds me of in the military, everybody's a safety officer. I mean, that was something. I mean, right? You see anything that's unsafe, stop the exercise immediately.
You've got your job in tanks or artillery or infantry or a pilot, but you're also a safety officer, right?
Exactly. 100%. I love that. And I hadn't heard it put that way with the values, but that's a great lesson for businesses to instill that, to continue to grow that culture. Now I want to shift gears a little bit because I want to ask what could be considered a dangerous question. Is what lesson, Greg? What lesson did you gain from Dad? From that experience, your experience growing up and working with Dad, wherever, at what point in life, wherever you want to pull that lesson, what's that number one lesson Dad gave you?
Yeah. Well, there are many to choose from when it comes to my father and my mother. But one of the big lessons from business leadership and turnarounds and just the whole approach is the people point that we talked about earlier. I remember as a kid growing up, my dad would invite the family over to the company picnics, or he'd invite my brother and me over to the office, and he would introduce us to people, and always would make a priority, as hectic as it was, as much as he had on his plate. If one of us called, it was like everything stops. What's going on? Is everything okay? Definitely made a priority, but also making a priority of the relationships of the people. And I really noticed, I got to know some of my father's colleagues as I got older, as I got into university and grad school and my own career. And, a lot of them talked about the remarkable experience they had together as a team, that it was a highlight of their career. And these are people talking about like brutal times. I mean, they would look back on, the organ donation, experience of 4 years, and they would look back fondly on it, not because of the punishing hours or the personal sacrifices that they made, but because of the bonding and the respect and the culture that they did it together, and so that was a real lesson, that truly it is all about relationships and it's all about the people.
All right, now it's your turn, Camden.
See, okay, I was writing it down because I thought you were going to send it over to me. I was ready for this.
You're lucky I didn't go. I made Greg go first, so consider yourself lucky on that.
Well, so here's the big question: is this the best lesson I got from Coach Otis, or best lesson I got from Dad? Because that's a big difference.
Your pick. Your pick.
Okay, well, I'll take Dad because that's the one I wrote down because I figured. See, I anticipated your actions on that a little bit. So you taught me this. We were talking about this in high school with soccer and rugby, getting a captaincy of the hardest thing you will do in life is be a leader of your peers. And now that was a great life lesson then. But I've realized recently how much that applies in everything besides sports. That's not just sports, because in reality, everyone I work with is my peer. When I'm starting my company, especially in the situation I'm in, where I'm just recruiting random people who are willing to put in work for free, like I am, they're we're pulling people together like that. They're all my peers. They're my friends. That's the reason that I've reached out to them, because they're in my network. But it is still a very hard thing to do, to be the leader in that situation, because you have to get them to work. You have to, push them. You have to push them beyond things. You have to be strict. But you also have to walk that fine line of, like you were saying, Greg, it's still personal. It's very personal when they're your peers. And you have to walk that fine line and make sure you're not stepping on toes too much, because you don't want to ruin a friendship over some business thing, which in my case might have lasted 2 weeks, right? If I have a great business idea that only lasts 2 weeks, I don't want to lose a friendship over that. That's just stupid. Or even if it lasts a longer time than that, there's no sense in having something come in the way of it. Just like how if you're a captain on a rugby team, you shouldn't have your friends hating you over it. You shouldn't lose friendships because you were trying to get them to perform at a high level. You have to be able to walk that fine line. And I think by far that's one of the best things you've taught me.
Well,
Do we
thanks.
have time, Otis and Cam, for me to answer the question of what I learned from Greg?
That's exactly what I was going to ask you next, Bob. You got it, man.
Well, when we decided to write Triple Crown Leadership, Greg invited me to write it. He had co-authored 2 books, and I was honored. I was a student of leadership. He became a student of leadership over his life, and he invited me to write it. And that was a highlight of my life. That work, the launch of that book, was one of the rare moments, like getting married or the birth of our sons. That was one of the highlights of my life. And we approached it not as father and son, as dad and son, but as peers, Bob and Greg. And I was on this treadmill in turnaround work that was probably putting me on the road to a heart attack. I wanted to write a book on leadership, get it out there fast, get a New York publisher, and Greg said, no. We want to write the definitive book on leadership. We want to do our research. We want to interview people. We want to go deep. I want to be thoughtful. And because we approach this as peers, I said, okay. And so I slowed down, and he probably sped up, and we compromised and we listened. And I learned how deep he was. I learned how incredibly smart he was, how thoughtful he was, the things from his generation that he brought in. And a huge amount of respect was created for me with my son, working with him as a peer-to-peer adult. And he taught me about the value of family. My wife had raised our boys. I didn't spend as much time. I'm spending a lot more time. I'm making up for that now. So the life lessons I learned about family, about depth, about sanctuary, about people, a lot of that came from Greg. And that's a lesson that he taught me that I will be forever grateful for.
That's awesome. So I'll just move on to the next subject now. No.
Oh, come on.
No, I mean, I could quite frankly say ditto there, Bob, because what Camden. I mean, he's the youngster in our quadrant here, but here's this young man who is figuring things out as he goes along with this. He's got a base of knowledge, but he continues to improve that knowledge and continues to challenge himself. And that right there, leads me back to the, okay, I'll figure this out. All right. I'll try that again, because, if he's able to do that, if he's able to take on these new challenges and new ways of thinking and doing things based on old school thinking that he learned from me and a bunch of Stoics, that right there is motivation enough for me to bounce me forward into that same respect. And then the other piece, and I love this that you said this, Bob, too, is the fact that it's really cool. And somebody else had said this once before, and I don't remember who it was, but you transition from this father-son relationship to a co-relationship and almost a peer relationship. And that's a really unique thing to be able to have with one of your children, and all your children. I mean, quite frankly, it's really kind of cool to it's no longer the, hey, did you take you out the trash? I need you to mow the lawn. It's no longer that. It's like, hey, let's go grab a beer and let's talk about this problem set. And I think that right there is one of the coolest things, that as a father, when you get to that point with your children, that's fun. It's I like hanging out with my kids because I like to talk to them. I like to spend time with them. So yeah, that's spot on, Bob. Thanks for leading that for us. And
Greg suggested that we ask Stephen Covey and his son, Stephen M.R. Covey, to write the foreword to Triple Crown Leadership. And we had some contact with them. And so I think Greg contacted them, and they said, well, we'll take a look at the manuscript, and if we like it, we'll write something. So we sent it. So we sent them the manuscript, and they loved it. And they wrote a very, very heartwarming foreword to our book. And then afterwards, Stephen Covey unfortunately died in a biking accident. And I spoke to Stephen M.R. Covey afterwards, and he said, I will always remember working with my dad to write the foreword for the book that you and Greg wrote. It was the last thing that we worked on together. And it was one of the most wonderful things. And he said, that will be a lifelong memory for me. That's how important it was. So these father-son, whether it's mother-son, mother-daughter, father-daughter relationships, these kinds of relationships to build as they become adults as peers are so important. And when Stephen M.R. Covey said that about his work for us with his dad, it just really touched my heart.
Oh, that's an unbelievable memory and something to hold on to. Yeah. Wow. What an honor. Yeah. So what'd you learn, Camden?
Well, so one thing I just wanted to say real quick was, as we were tying all these together, mine was talking about leading your peers, and as Otis and Bob were talking, one thing I was thinking about so much is the ability to switch gears like that. I think that's something really profound, that you have to have that ability in life. Of, like, I have friends that are, I guess as the lead entrepreneur, they might be my employees, if you put that perspective. Whatever, I don't think about it that
We're
way.
not employees until you pay them.
Exactly. So, but you have that shift in perspective of, they're my friend right now, sometimes they're the employee. And I know I've had that interaction with you multiple times, Dad, because I know I do social media for him for LTO. So I am an employee and he is the boss. We do the Cam and Otis show together, so we are peers. And I still call him asking for fatherly advice. So we're still father and son. And it's being able to shift those gears like that, I think, is just something that is just so fundamentally useful in life, because we all have different relationships with the people, but you want to be able to utilize every level of that relationship properly.
Right.
So there's a roundabout way of getting into our closing segment.
What you learned? That's an awful long paragraph.
I mean, that's just the thesis. I can keep going. No, so the thing I learned, I started a few things as we were talking. One, I just want to give Bob, this isn't the main thing I wanted to learn, but I really wanted to reiterate it because I love the quote of just, I learned the most when I got fired. I love that, because I just think failure can teach you so much, and not necessarily that you were a failure every time you got fired. I don't want to conjecture that together too much. But the big thing that I really want to take away from this is what you were talking about, Greg, the kill thrill. I think that takes what I've used before in my experience in business of the pre-mortem, and it just puts it on steroids, honestly. It really takes that pre-mortem concept and just ramps it up another 5 or 6 more levels. How can you kill this project? And then how can we combat the things that we were just trying to kill? I love that perspective on it. So great. Oh.
Yeah, throw it to Greg then. Thank you.
Oh, no, you throw it to Greg.
All right, I'll throw it to Greg. What you learned?
Yeah, so for me, what's really popping up here is heart, actually. We kind of ended with the Coveys, and like so many people around the world, I just admire the Coveys, and they have filled my heart with inspiration and so much. And when we have the opportunity to talk to Cam and Otis here, you guys have heart, and it's just really special as father and son to be with another father-son pairing, or to think about all the mothers and daughters and the mothers and sons, et cetera, out there. And I think it just, everything we talked about today, to me, goes back to heart. And, I think, in work, too often we're in our heads, and it's about spreadsheets, and it's about emails, it's about meetings and Slack, and it's about, strategies and budgets. And of course, all that's important. We need to have a really good head and to bring our A game and to have really smart people. But we also need a heart. If we're going to lead through a crisis, we need people with integrity. We need people with courage. We need people who are emotionally intelligent, people that we admire, people who make us better. And and in a business, it's not just about the numbers. It's about your people and your customers and your community. And in a crisis, it's not just about infection rates and death rates and viral spread. It's people. And so it all goes back to everything we said about people and culture. If we can engage people at the heart level, so that there's a higher purpose, so that they truly feel connected because they're vulnerable, and there's friendships and there's depth and there's real care and affection shown, that becomes a beautiful thing, and that we'll look back on and we'll be proud of. So for me, it's heart.
Awesome. Thanks. Bob, your turn.
What I learned today is that Otis and Cam are exemplars of the quest of my life. Starting out as the captain of high school football team when I was 14, I've been on a quest to find a better brand of leadership. I think, as Ronald Reagan once said, in the end, it all comes down to leadership. Whether you're on the left or the right, or pandemics or global warming or whatever, it all comes down to leadership. And we've got too many examples of bad leadership in today's world. So my quest has been to find a way, a better brand of leadership. I found it. Took me a long time. Maybe I was a slow learner. But once I learned it and began teaching it, writing it, thanks to Greg's invitation and what he brought to my thinking on it. My purpose in life is to try and share with people what I've learned about a better brand of leadership. And the two of you exemplify that. And I can't tell you how much that warms my heart to see that you're carrying on that work. It really touches me deeply.
Thanks, Bob. That was awesome. That's hard to follow. Gosh.
Yeah, right. I'm getting real sentimental over here.
Yeah, I mean, and now I feel bad about what I learned. Goodness gracious. I mean, y'all are all up here in this philosophical, beautiful place. And I'm like,
You're over there like 2 + 2 is 4.
Yeah,
so.
exactly. I learned this practical approach for when I come into a business at a takeover of how to clean house very easily and find the problem sets and reset the culture, which is a very practical approach. And I'm putting that in my pocket, Bob, and you're going to get full credit every time I use it from here on.
Notice this is not a competition between 4 people. We collectively do this together.
There you go, man. That's even better. See?
You can't follow that either.
I know. It's
Just have Bob do the closing statements.
That's right. You just run over here, man. No, hey guys, what an honor. What a privilege. A lot of fun. And man, I thoroughly enjoyed myself and really appreciate y'all taking time out of the day and sharing your philosophy and your thought processes and answering some of those hard questions, and giving some lessons that are practical and we can apply moving forward.
You're very welcome, Otis. Cam, thank you for the invitation.
Yeah, thanks for being here. Thank you, Greg and Bob Vanarek, for being a great guest today. Thank you for our sponsor, MASH Hemp, military and athletic strength hemp oil. You guys can check out the Cam and Otis Show on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn a little bit. And then you can check out our podcast episodes on Spotify, Apple Podcast, or wherever you get your podcast, and check out a full archive at thecamandotishow.buzzsprout.com. Thank y'all again for joining us today, and thank y'all for listening.
Thanks.